Okay, let's see, are we recording? All right, good. All right, so 4.2. So 4.2 is a section where we take that knowledge of the anatomy of the categorical syllogism, right, and we play with it a little bit. There's a little bit of greater classification, but basically in 4.2, we're going to learn the names of these things and how those parts function with a little bit more refinement, right? So we're still going to draw some more charts, but now that you know what the parts of a categorical proposition are, I can actually use some of the vocabulary to describe what these things are, right? So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of just draw up. I'm just going to say all SRP, right? And then I'm going to say no SRP. And then by the S, I mean subject, and then by P, I mean predicate term, right? Then I'm going to say some SRP. And then I'm going to say some S are not P. Now remember this last one, the copula is technically are not. It's just not the word are, right? So it's the only one where the not is contained inside the copula. That's very important, by the way, that we recognize that. Now, what we're going to do is you kind of already know a little bit about how these things are behaving, but just to review from that very first one, when I say all dogs are mammals, I'm saying that S is completely contained in P. So every member of the class of what is inside S, whatever the category may be, is universally contained inside P. When I say no chairs are American voters, there's no such thing that the category chair will ever apply to the predicate category American voter, right? So chairs don't vote. Reminds me of a joke once. A little 5-year-old from Georgia once told me, what did the salt shaker say to the Pepsi shaker? And I said, I don't know. And then she said, nothing, you idiot. Salt shakers don't talk. And then she proceeded to find 2 more perceived objects in the kitchen. What did the napkin holder say to the toaster? I said, I don't know. She said, nothing. Napkin holders don't talk. And she kept picking 2 objects, right? But there will never be all the objects that she was picking were perceived in the room, but those things are types of things that will never talk to each other. So it's kind of like no SRP in a really fun way. But no reptiles are mammals, and no mammals are reptiles, right? Fair enough. S, whatever is inside S, and whatever is inside P will always be categories that are just never touching. They're always going to be excluded. Excluded universally, right? No reptile will ever be a mammal, and no mammal will ever be. So these categories will always be excluded from each other. Now you're still saying something universally there. So the all and no are functioning in a universal capacity, right? And these are our universal quantifiers for that reason. They make a claim universally about S universally. Like either every member of S will never be contained inside P, or every member of S will be included in P, is another way of stating that universal relationship. And then we have these are what we might say more particular. They don't say anything about universals. They say things only about like some, and some means at least one. So it means like a handful or something like that. And then some S are not P. We have a particular statement, but this one is negative rather than affirming some inclusion of S inside P, right? So these are the particular quantifiers, and these are the negative ones. So our first grouping depends on the quantity. So quantity is our first thing, right? And this one is universal. This one is also universal. This one is particular. And this is particular. So the first name of what these things are called come from the quantifiers that are in front of them and how those quantifiers talk about the subject term. Now, the next thing, and we've also talked a little bit about this in the last lecture, but S is inside P. The positive version of that, that's one relationship that we're tracking here in terms of this system. And then there's an exclusionary, like S will never be part of P, right? So that's a negative inclusion, and this affirms inclusion, right? So to say this is to say that every member of S, all dogs are mammals, and to say that dogs will always be part of mammals, is that we call it the universal affirmative. We are affirming that S is part of P. And that's what we mean by this. But because this particular one also affirms a handful of S are also P, like some Ford cars are blue vehicles, right? My Ford Fiesta is blue, by the way. Now, not all of them are blue. I had to pay $1,000 extra to get a blue car, apparently, right? But, you know, that is affirmative. Just because it's just a handful of cars that are blue and Ford, right? So this is the particular affirmative. It means at least one S is included in P. Now, likewise, if this is affirmative, right, and these are the positive that S is in some measure part of P, either universally or partially. But no SRP is universal, but because it's an exclusionary relationship that S will never be part of P, we call this the universal negative. Okay. And then because some S are not P, that there's some S that will always be outside this group P, even if it's just one or two, right? Because that's an exclusionary relationship, we call this negative. So when you put together the quantity and then we call this the quality is the name of how much S is either included or not included in P. That's how you get the different names. You get the different names by putting together the quantity first and then the quality second. And then so this is known as the universal affirmative, all SRP. This is known as the universal negative, no SRP. This is the particular affirmative, some SRP. And this is the particular negative, some S are not P, right? Now, if we weren't done confusing you enough in terms of what you need to know for the rest of the unit in the next two sections that we do in this chapter, right? We also have Latin abbreviations that we come to learn. And knowing that this is a proposition, right? So I'm going to do another line here and I'm going to say Latin abbreviation, right? And then so all SRP is technically what we call the A proposition. I'll just say A prop, right? And then universal negative is called the E proposition. And for the rest of the chapter, they're going to use these Latin abbreviations. They won't even like use this language over here, even though we will use the language in the classroom about these things. It just, you know, but you need to know what these names are tracking. And what they're tracking is both the quantifier and the relationship between S and P. That's the quality. Now, the Latin abbreviation for this is E proposition. The particular affirmative is known as the I proposition, right? And then the particular negative is known as the O proposition. So that's, now, there is one other thing that we're going to study inside this unit. Now we're going to study the rules of distribution. The rules of distribution are hard to explain, but basically a term is a subject or predicate term is considered distributed if it makes a claim about every member of that class of objects within it. So some of these will have distribution very clearly and others won't, right? Now, there is a little phrase that I like to sort of teach when I'm teaching distribution. I constantly repeat it inside the classroom in the physical classroom, but I'm going to say it on the video a lot of times from here on out. And that is universals distribute subjects, negatives distribute their predicates. And that's how this works. So I'm going to say, let me see, I have more room down here. Universals distribute subjects. Negatives distribute predicates. So, and now distribution is a property of the subject and predicate terms only, right? So now that you know their names and you kind of know what subject and predicate terms are from 4.1, the rules of distribution can now be applied. And so to denote distribution of terms in terms of this section, what I'm going to do on the lecture right now is circle those terms that are distributed within each of the different propositions, right? So if this is a universal affirmative, and we know that universals distribute the subject terms only, what gets distributed, the S or the P? Pause to consider. That's right. Only the subject term gets distributed, right? Now, remember, universals distribute their subjects, negatives distribute their predicates. So, is no SRP a universal proposition? Pause to consider. Got its name? Yes, it is. So it will distribute its subject term. Now, does it, if negatives distribute their predicates, is the quality of this E proposition, right? I'm just going to start using the Latin abbreviations just to sort of get you used to it, right? Is it negative? Yes, it is. So it distributes its predicate. Now, what makes this distribution kind of interesting right here is this is the only one right here that distributes both equally because it's the universal negative. And you could kind of see that if universals distribute their subject and negatives distribute their predicates, then by its very name, this would be the only one that distributes both. And this is the only one where you could take the S and the P and reverse them and have the original truth value of that statement preserved. So when I say no reptiles are mammals, that has the same truth value as if I were to reverse it and say no mammals are reptiles. And it's the only one I could do that to, right? And it's because of this, the rule, how the rules of distribution occur, right? So like if I were to say all dogs are mammals and then reverse P and S and say all mammals are dogs, clearly you see that's false, and it completely changes the meaning of switching the S and the P. And because both are not distributed, I can't switch them around. In fact, all S or P only works with S being contained in P, right? But you could exclude equally in both ways with this distribution in mind. It's kind of cool. Now, likewise, equally cool is the particular affirmative, right? Is it universal? No. So is it subject distributed? Subject is not distributed. Is it a negative? No. So the predicate isn't distributed. So neither the subject or the predicate term are distributed in I propositions or particular affirmatives. So we're not going to circle either S or the P, right? And then for the particular negative, is this a universal statement? No, it's not. It's a particular. Is it a negative statement? Yes. So the P is distributed. Now, it might seem kind of strange, but if I said to you, some Ford cars are not blue vehicles. right? I am excluding universally. Every member of this group over here will never contain this handful of group over here. So you can think of it a little bit, there is a sort of claim made about every membership of the P class in terms of every member of P will not include universally whatever the handful of S is, right? That's kind of a weird thing to think that that's distributed, but it is because it's a negative. And every member of this class is excluded from this class. That's the every member thing that's going on there. Now, I can also use the rules of distribution to talk to you a little bit, right? And of course, you could pause, you can go back to this chart. I do need to erase it because of what I'm going to show you, right? Let me get my bearings here. Okay, so now that you know the rules of distribution, right? And I'll keep repeating that universals distribute their subjects, negatives distribute their predicates. And that's something to note here, right? But do you remember in chapter 1 where I said to you that I will be able to explain to you why it is the case that this categorical syllogism with the words at the very end is an invalid form? Well, technically, I have enough knowledge now in lecture to sort of build that up. So I'm going to give this to you. I'm going to preempt a little bit, right? But a rule for a valid categorical syllogism is that the middle term must be distributed at least once, right? So that's really important to remember. And then you know that in all SRP, right, the only term that's distributed in the universal affirmative is right here because it's a universal affirmative, it's the subject term. So I might have said something like, make sure you watch out for the diagonal because the middle term must be distributed at least once. Now, the middle term is the word that links the premise and conclusion together in order to draw an inference, right? Now, we did see this on page 48 inside our book. So let me go back to the book real quick just to kind of draw our attention back to something that we were talking about. I believe it might have been, what, 68 maybe? Might be the, here we go, right? So take a look here, right? Now you see how these categorical syllogisms are all AAA statements, right? But notice here, all flowers are plants, all daisies are plants. Therefore, all daisies are flowers. The word plant and plant is the middle term. Now, the middle term must be distributed at least once, otherwise it's going to be an invalid syllogism. So in order for the word plants to be distributed, it would need to occur in this first position or this first position. So I said to you, it does not matter where that middle term is. You just need to have it appear in diagonal formulation so that it is at least distributed once. So notice in this column, all the invalid arguments like plants, plants, flowers, 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 cats, cats, these are all in invalid form already. Whereas these are valid, but sound or unsound, right? This one's valid and sound. So this valid structure has flowers here in the diagonal. So when I said watch out for these formulations, that's the reason why. The middle term for it must be distributed at least once. Now, there's other things that go into creating a valid syllogism, but that's one of the hard rules, right? And we'll learn some more rules coming and going if we get that far in the course. But for right now, just know that, like, right? Plants, plants, flowers, 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 cats, cats. If the middle term occurs at the end, it could never be distributed in terms of how these things are built. So these are purposely built as invalid structures, and that's one of the hard rules. Now, let's see, go back to our book. I don't know, what is it like? Was it 168 or so? Okay, sorry. But anyway, I just wanted to kind of draw your attention to that. Right, and this is 3. So give me a second. So here's 4 and then 4, 2. Right. So basically I kind of already kind of explained this notation, but if you want to take a look at that chart, that basically says the same thing I said in different ways. Right. But here is the distribution, right? So here's the distribution, the terms that get distributed. All SRP, some SRP, all SRP distributes the subject term. No SRP distributes both. The I proposition distributes neither, and the O proposition distributes only the predicate, right? So what you have to do in this next homework, right, and this is Roman numeral 4.2 part 1, is take a look at the subject and predicate terms and tell me whether or not the subject or predicate terms are distributed or undistributed. I'll do that in a separate video, right? The other thing to sort of consider here, right, is we might have had an example of an invalid structure that was built with I, right? So let me go back to in-person lecturing here. So if you had like some SU students are persons from Louisiana, LA, and then you had some persons from LA are, I don't know, persons who pay tuition. Maybe that'll work. Yeah, that'll work. And then conclusion, some SU students are persons who pay tuition. I'm just going to put a $sign. You'll notice that if you have and this is an I proposition, I proposition, I proposition. If you have a syllogism that's an I, nothing could be distributed at all. So immediately you should recognize that this is an invalid argument form. I believe there might have been a problem like this in like the one in the first chapter with just sums but with no explanation. So if there was, I apologize. If I'm just sort of like saying, how would you apply this knowledge? Eventually you would take the rules of distribution and apply it to, oh, I see, there are different logical relationships between the statements about what we can replace with those things. And in addition to that, you could start to think a little bit about how these things might be put together in terms of either being valid. Like I could build valid syllogisms where if my premises are true, my conclusion will guarantee to be true, and my conclusion could not be false. But also I could put these things together in awkward ways where they're just invalid and they don't actually guarantee the truth of conclusion. So there's both good versions and bad versions of how syllogisms are structured, right? So keep that in mind. And I'm just adding a little bit more fluff and content to the distribution stuff because it's really appropriate to sort of give that to you right now. Okay. So that is basically kind of fluffing up what we did in 4.2. I think that I'm kind of done making videos today, so you'll probably see me in a different shirt with the videos that are left to come. And then, of course, we'll do a separate video, but basically what you have to do is you just have to know the rules but you need to know the nomenclature of what these things are called so that that context clue of universals distribute their subjects and then negatives distribute their predicates. You need to know what the quantity and quality is in order to map that all out, right? And there will be some reading content in 4.3. We're not going to do Venn diagrams, but I still want you to know about them. I still want you to read them because understanding Venn diagrams informs the background of the difference between the Aristotelian and Boolean standpoint on existential import. So that's stuff that's kind of down the pipeline of what we're doing. So just keep in mind that just because we're not doing Venn diagrams, you still have to conceptually understand them enough to understand some further points that I will be making in that unit. Okay, so again, keep thinking logically and cool beans.